Kidwelly is a small, picturesque town in the south of Wales, United Kingdom. It is home to just under 3,500 residents and boasts stunning medieval visuals of old castles and churches. Quite frankly, the streets of Kidwelly look like something out of a cozy British novel that you might be reading on a Sunday morning with a warm cup of tea. And that could be true, but only if the novel you were reading was of the horror genre. Because this small, picturesque town experienced one of the scariest satanic cults I've ever came across. The devil once resided in this small community and changed it forever. It's the 1990s, a time of grunge fashion, iconic TV shows, and the rise of the internet. Now picture all of that, but you're also living in Kidwelly, a charming little town where everybody knows your name, a small community filled with beautiful visuals and a peaceful vibe. But as things often go, all good things come to an end. Somewhere around the mid-90s, this idyllic town was struck by a dark cloud in the form of an unlikely visitor. One day, the devil himself strolled into Kidwelly, carrying his luggage, eager to make this charming little town his permanent home. The old saying goes that the devil is known by many names, and in this instance, Kidwelly was about to meet a man named Colin Batley. Colin Batley was a scruffy man, missing a few teeth, and not exactly the type you'd expect to find at a fancy dinner party. He was born in 1963 and grew up in Shoreditch, London. He wasn't very educated. He was your typical lower-class individual. He'd worked a variety of jobs, from running a fruit and vegetable stand to being a Tesco security guard. But his life in London and his job were left behind when he made a decision to move to Kidwelly. And of course, he didn't come empty-handed. The devil never does. He arrived in town with 3 of his most loyal followers, his wife, Aleister Crowley, and 2 of their closest friends, Jacqueline Marling and Shelley Mylar. Now these 4, if you haven't already figured it out, aren't your everyday normal individuals. Sure, from a distance they might have seemed unremarkable. Yeah, Colin was missing a few teeth and he was supposedly very arrogant, but that didn't exactly raise any red flags. However, if you got close enough to them, you would realize the true meaning of the phrase wolf in sheep's clothing. All 4 of them had tattoos of the Eye of Horus on their hands. Colin's wife, Elaine, had a pentagram inked on her leg, along with a tattoo of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun and some Egyptian script on her back. In fact, all of them had similar tattoos scattered over their bodies, but the one they all shared, the one that was identical to all of them, was the Eye of Horus one. It was a symbol that marked them as members of a satanic cult known simply as the Church. The leader of this coven was Colin Batley. The 3 women were his most loyal followers, who referred to Colin as my lord. Colin ruled over them with an iron fist, controlling every aspect of their lives. And when he decided to move to Kidwelly, the 3 women followed without a question. Their arrival in this small town isn't by accident, however. The group chose this small community as the perfect place to expand their cult activities. They set up their tightly knit operation in a Kidwelly cul-de-sac called Closier'Onen. According to a map published by the Daily Mail, the 4 of them were living remarkably close to one another. Colin and Aleister Crowley resided at number 7, Jacqueline Marling at number 8, and Shelley Mylar at number 23. If you entered any of their homes, you'd be greeted with a collection of satanic and Egyptian symbols, along with various occult items. The cult itself drew inspiration from the philosophy of the infamous English occultist Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, often dubbed the wickedest man in the world, was one of the most notorious figures in Western esotericism. He's best known for founding his own religion, Thelema, which emphasized individual will, personal freedom, and the pursuit of one's true will as the life's highest purpose. His teachings combined elements of mysticism, astrology, and ceremonial magic, but in practice, Crowley's lifestyle was far from conventional, advocating for borderline satanic sex rituals and drug-fueled escapades. And he was overall a very despicable character. But anyways, The core of his principles was laid out in the Book of the Law, which Crowley wrote in Cairo, Egypt in 1904. Back to Colin Batley and the church, a laminated version of the Book of the Law was present in each of the cult's residences. It was their foundation. However, this disturbing cult took Crowley's teachings and reformulated them into something more sinister. As soon as they settled in, their sinister grip tightened around the quiet town of Kidwelly. The cult began weaving their claws into the fabric of the community. At first, it was subtle. They got to know the locals, sized up the residents, and then slowly zeroed in on their real targets, the children of Kidwelly. Almost without exception, their targets were troubled, vulnerable kids, lost souls, and an easy target for manipulation. Through a mix of coercion and threats, the cult lured these teenagers into their world. And by world, I mean black ritual masses followed by group activities. Every week, they'd gathered at one of the cult's residences for these ceremonies, which were led by Colin Batley, their self-styled high priest. Batley and other cult members would be standing before a room of young teens, wearing occult robes, preaching about their twisted philosophy, reciting from the Book of the Law. And once they were done preaching, they would undress and assault these children. And these poor kids had no choice. This cult either brainwashed them into believing that if they disobeyed, they would anger the gods, who would send them to the abyss, which was their version of hell. Or the cult would just threaten them outright, and they weren't messing around. Colin Batley also kept two vicious Rottweilers named Sekhet and Tutankhamun, and a cat named Ramses at the house. These weren't your typical lovable pets, they were enforcers for the cult, snarling and snapping at anyone who would step out of the line at these rituals. And it gets much, much worse. A lot of these crimes were recorded, taped, and most likely distributed. And so after the first initiation ritual, the teenagers kept coming back, trapped by a combination of fear and shame. Fear of those videos surfacing, fear of death, fear of defying the gods. As time went on, the cult grew. 4 core adult members ballooned into more, allegedly a fairly decent roster of adults participating in these satanic parties, which basically became sick marketplaces where they would pass around their young victims. Now at this point, you might be wondering, how is this operation being funded? I mean, Colin left his job, landed at Kidwelly, but also had money to fund this nightmare. Well, like so many twisted cults, the baloney philosophy they're selling you was just a mask, a flimsy excuse for the sex, and of course, the money. Colin Batley didn't just orchestrate an intricate web of abuse. He built a lucrative racket. A bunch of these kids were forced into prostitution, and every penny they would make would be funneled straight to the cult. 2 of his inner circle members, Jacqueline Marling and Shelley Mylar, were also reportedly spotted working in the cities of Swansea and Bristol. Actually, a neighbor of Batley's even recalled an encounter he had with one of Batley's victims. One day, while he was tending his garden, a girl in her early teens, dressed up like some Hollywood actress, offered him sex, and that same neighbor also heard crying every night from one of the victims. Now, an interesting and terrifying individual in this cult operation was the before-mentioned Jacqueline Marling, a figure almost as vile and despicable as Colin Batley himself. In fact, she was his right hand, second in command of the church. Why? Well, because she was Colin's mistress. Now, obviously, that doesn't matter that much, because at these group activities, they all intertwined. But supposedly, Marling and Batley had a deeper connection he kept secret from his wife, Elaine. One of the cult's most well-known victims was Marling's own daughter, who later, under a pseudonym Annabelle Forrest, wrote a gut-wrenching book called The Devil on the Doorstep: My Escape from a Satanic Sex Cult. In it, she lays out the nightmare her mother dragged her into. Jacqueline Marling didn't just stand by, she handed her daughter over to the cult. Annabelle recounts in her book how she was repeatedly raped by Colin Batley, her own mother, Jacqueline Marling, and thousands of others, as she was forced into prostitution from an early age. And you want to know the most disturbing part? She gave birth to Batley's child. Batley wanted to keep the baby because he described it as a child of the occult. Furthermore, in her book, Annabelle paints a chilling picture of isolation the cult's victims experienced. She writes, "They were completely cut off from the outside world. No friends, no normalcy. We weren't even allowed to look in his eyes," she wrote of Batley. "He ruled their little corner of Kidwelly like a dictator. His iron will, enforced by threats of divine wrath. Step out of the line and you'd anger the gods. Fear was their leash." But the cult wasn't just about rituals and abuse, it was also business. Beyond the prostitution, Batley and his crew ran a van, allegedly peddling contraband tobacco and pornography. A local in Kidwelly said they would take off to France for weeks at a time. What were they up to there? Well, nobody knows for sure, but we can kind of connect the dots. I mean, Colin Batley was this uneducated, scruffy man who didn't have a job in Kidwelly. And yet he funded this nightmare and the cash kept pouring in. It's obvious he built an intricate criminal network where he distributed and sold the despicable content they recorded. I mean, he was truly a disgusting, vile man. And the crown of Colin's despicable persona, and one event that really tells you you're dealing with someone who is extremely psychopathic, happened in 2008. That year, Colin's son, Damien Batley, died while he accidentally hanged himself during a sex act gone wrong. And if that wasn't disturbing enough for you, a neighbor of Batley said that on the day of Damien's funeral, Colin was laughing and joking like he didn't have a care in the world. His own son's funeral, and he's cracking jokes. That's who you're dealing with. And this cult has stretched on for years, operating in the shadows, untouchable, destroying dozens of young lives. And where it gets even darker, according to a Daily Mail post, in 2002, a relative of one of the abused kids reported this cult to social services. Guess what happened? Nothing. Zip. The cult just kept rolling forward. It wasn't until nearly a decade later, in 2010, when the tides turned. Two victims, now adults, one male and one female, finally gathered courage to report Colin Batley and the church to the police. What followed was a messy, complicated investigation that ultimately dragged Colin Batley, Jacqueline Marling, Elaine Batley, Shelley Mylar, and a guy named Vincent Barden into custody. Police couldn't get the tapes of the rituals because they were supposedly destroyed before the raid because, get this, Colin Batley was tipped off by someone that his arrest was coming. Luckily, however, in 2011, they were all sentenced to prison. But here's the kicker, almost all of them are free now. Jacqueline Marling got 12 years, Elaine Batley 8, Shelley Mylar 5, and Vincent Barden a measly 3. They were sentenced in 2011, it's 2025 now, so you do the math. They're free, wandering somewhere in the world. Colin Batley is, however, an exception. His sentence was indeterminate, with a minimum of 11 years, meaning he's got to serve at least that before even sniffing parole. As of now, he's still, thankfully, rotting behind bars. Kidwelly was and is a speck of a town, with barely 3,500 residents, a tight-knit place where you'd think nothing slips by unnoticed. And yet for more than a decade, Colin Batley's The Church operated without a dent, despite later reports of neighbors and locals noticing strange behavior around these people. Strange vibes, creepy encounters, red flags, etc. And what did the community do? Jacqueline's daughter Annabelle put it best in her book. If there's one thing I'd love to achieve with this, it's to get people to actually pay attention to the community they live in. You can't just drift through life in a bubble. Kids are everywhere. It only takes one person to spot it, and that life could be saved. She's not wrong. We should know our surroundings better, get to know your community, and when you're faced with something odd, something scary, something that sets off alarm bells, don't just freeze or look the other way. If you see someone hurting, if you even suspect harm is being done, do something. Act. You might just save someone's life, or at the very least, spare someone a lifetime of trauma. Because here's the thing, if we stopped being passive, if we stop giving these monsters the shadows they thrive in, maybe, just maybe, creeps like Colin Batley won't have a chance to wreck any more lives. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed my video. If you want to support my channel, you can hit this round button right here. That's the subscribe button. I would appreciate it very much. You can also check some of my older videos on the right here, and check out some of my other activities down below. Thank you for watching.